Hi, it's me Leo back again with another video. So I was actually hoping to make a car video today, but the weather's been absolutely terrible, as you know if you live in the UK. What we're doing instead is we're going to have a look at this Samsung Galaxy S6. So in this video we're going to revisit the Samsung Galaxy S6, have a look at its features and kind of see how it stacks up in 2023. And as always, if you do enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We are on the road to 2,000 subscribers. Let's go on with the video. So basically I was clearing out my old car, getting ready to sell it, and in the glove compartment I had this phone as basically a spare backup phone. But as I was selling the car I took it out and it's a good phone to review actually. So this was essentially Samsung's flagship phone back in 2015. So this was sort of their flagship. What I mean is at the same time as releasing this S6, Samsung also released the S6 Plus, which was a larger version of this phone. And 2015 was also the year they introduced the S6 Edge. The Samsung Galaxy S6 Edge, which if you remember was essentially an S6, but it had rounded edges. So yeah, you could argue that that was their most premium flagship device, but on paper this has very similar specs to that. So let's have a look at the specifications of this Samsung Galaxy S6. So as we've already mentioned, this was released back in 2015 and it was the replacement for the S5, which came out the year before. So the standard Samsung Galaxy S6 came with a 5.1 inch Quad HD AMOLED screen. And by today's standards, this still is a very nice screen. It's got a very, very high pixel density. This screen has a higher pixel density than a lot of smartphones that come out in 2023. And because it's an AMOLED screen, I have good colors and very inky blacks. But where this display differs from modern day smartphones is that it's only a 60 Hz panel, whereas a lot of phones released in 2023 come with a 120 Hz display. So I've noticed the brightness on this display is okay, but it's nowhere near as good as some of the newer phones. So performance wise, the Samsung Galaxy S6 came with 3 GB of RAM and a Samsung own-made Exynos 7420 chip with 8 cores. So the Exynos chip in this phone was 14nm and it was one of the first chips to implement the design where there's 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. Before this phone came out, I don't believe a lot of manufacturers used that process. And as I mentioned, this has 3 GB of RAM, and just for some context, this is the Google Pixel 7 Pro that was released last year. And this phone isn't even considered a very high performance phone, but this has 12 GB of RAM and this has 3, so you can kind of see the difference that 7 years has made between these phones. So let's just have a quick chat about the camera on this Samsung Galaxy S6. So this comes with a 16 megapixel main shooter and a 5 megapixel selfie camera. Unlike modern smartphones, this only has one camera. There isn't any of that zoom lens and wide angle lens. It's just one camera and that's all you get. So the camera itself is actually fairly good by today's standards. It's a 16 megapixel shooter. Obviously the sensor size is a lot smaller than a lot of modern smartphones. But this can actually shoot 4K at 30 frames per second. So on paper this is actually a decent camera. But there are a few areas where this camera falls short compared to some newer cameras. The main one I've noticed is low light performance. The low light performance on this S6 is nowhere near as good as some of the newer smartphones. What I have noticed is images not taken in direct sunlight can look quite grainy and smeary. That's mainly down to the older image processing on this phone and the smaller sensor compared to newer smartphones. I also noticed that the dynamic range on this phone is not as good as some of the newer smartphones. One nice thing to see on this phone is it does have very good optical image stabilization. So software support started with Android 5, which is Android Lollipop, and you could upgrade this all the way up to Android 8, which was Android Oreo. So this phone came with a 2550 mAh battery, which by today's standards is quite a small battery. For comparison, this has a 5000 mAh battery, which is double. So back in the day, you would struggle to get to the end of a day on one charge with this phone. But because this phone is 8 years old, the battery in this particular phone is very, very degraded, so I'd probably struggle to get more than 1 hour out of this right now. And that brings me on to one interesting point about this phone is it's the first Samsung phone that they released without a removable battery. So up until this point, up until the Samsung Galaxy S5, all their phones were made of plastic and you could remove the back and change the battery. So that was no longer the case with this phone. It was yeah, the battery was sealed into the back of this phone, which was a bit of a controversial decision, but it's kind of one that they've stuck by ever since this phone. But at least this phone has a headphone jack. So I'm now going to change camera angle. We're going to have a chat about the design of this phone in a little bit more detail. Let's get on with it. So here we have the Samsung Galaxy S6, and the design is a very, very interesting feature of this phone because this was the first sort of premium. Before this, all the Samsung S phones were made out of plastic, whereas this phone is made out of glass, which is on the front and the back, and it has metal around the edge. So this phone, by today's standards, feels very nice in the hand. It's a very, very nice weight. It feels very, very premium. And all the materials that this phone is made of have held up really well over time. And one thing I do like is this is actually quite a small phone by today's standards. You don't usually get a lot of 5.1 inch phones, so it actually does feel quite nice to have a phone of this size. Another interesting feature of this Samsung Galaxy S6 is water resistance. So my understanding is this phone is not officially water resistant or IP certified, which is weird because the phone that came before it, which is the S5, was actually water resistant. So when they made this phone, they kind of removed water resistance for one generation. I believe after this phone was released, the S7 was actually water resistant, so they brought it back. But it's kind of an example of Samsung removing features just to re-release them with the following model. So I know this phone came in a few different colours. I know there was a white one, but I like the appearance of this one. This is like a bluish kind of shiny material. One way this differs to newer phones is the bezels. So this has a 16:9 aspect ratio screen, as did pretty much every phone back in 2015. So it's not one of those edge-to-edge displays. But to be honest, the front of this phone still does look quite modern, even if it doesn't have the edge-to-edge design. So the home button of this phone was actually a fingerprint reader as well. If you have a look at around the body of this phone, this edge is all metal and there's a SIM card slot and the power button. So I don't know if my camera's actually going to focus, but this comes with an IR blaster, so you could actually use this phone as a TV remote, which is always a nice feature. So on the opposite side, we've just got some volume buttons. So moving over to the bottom of this phone, as you can see, it has antenna bands, a headphone jack, which is very nice to see, a micro USB. So this was back in the day when all Android phones had micro USB, not USB-C. And then we have a single speaker grill on the other side, and then another antenna band with a little microphone hole there. On the front, we have the little 5 megapixel front-facing camera and some sensors. I believe these are light sensors, and it also has the speaker grill and the Samsung logo on the front. So this was released back in the era when Samsung phones had the TouchWiz skin over their Android. So that's going to wrap up this video. If you did enjoy, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We're on the road to 2,000 subscribers. Absolutely amazing. We're going to aim for 20 likes on this video, and I will see everyone in my next video.